Welcome to this episode of Ed Circuit Author Chats. We have a great pair of authors today whose book is about a topic that may be new to many K-12 educators, but presents some really compelling opportunities to consider for your students. Here with me, I have Nina Leacock and Jon Calos to discuss their book, Capstone, Inquiry and Action at School. Nina has taught English, humanities, composition, and research methods to students from 10th grade through graduate school. She was the co-director of the Capstone program at the Boss School in Albuquerque, New Mexico for more than a decade. Jon has taught biology, animal behavior, and other life science courses, so we have pretty much the full spectrum of subject matter covered here. And he has developed research and capstone programs at Emma Willard School in Troy, New York for the past 20 years. And he's the chair of the experiential learning department at Emma Willard, which is the department that runs the school's capstone program. And both Nina and Jon are founding members of the National Capstone Consortium. So Nina and Jon, welcome to Author Chats.
It's great to be here.
Thanks, Ross.
So, I think we're going to have a good number of listeners, as I mentioned, particularly in that K-12 range, for whom capstone education might be a new idea or something they don't know as much about. So I think we should start there. And Nina, what is capstone education? Can you give us a definition?
So I'm going to start by saying that capstone is a very adaptable form of programming, and any program is going to be school specific. So with that caveat, some common features include starting with the student. So capstone programs typically center on student interest and allow that student interest, usually individual, sometimes in a collaborative structure, to drive the projects. Another commonality among capstone programs is a shifting of power, not only in terms of choice about topics, but also in terms about choice about how to pursue the topics from the school and the teachers over to the students. Those, I would say, are a starting place. Typically, capstone programs, and now we're getting out into an area where there may be more variety, typically they include an inquiry component, what in the past we might have called research. So they typically include students working individually to learn about a topic using up-to-date research methods. They also typically include action components. I'm maybe getting ahead a little bit, but one of the things that was a joy in the book was that Jon and I came not only from different academic backgrounds, but from different types of programs, with his program having a strength in the action area and mine in the research area. A couple of other common features of capstone programs. The type of programs that we're looking at are senior year of high school. So they're also forming a bridge to help with that transition for students who are really heading into what for them is an enormous life transition as well as an academic transition. So the capstone program helps facilitate that. In some settings, that might be a transition into college, in others into a workplace, and different capstone programs would support that transition with different kinds of learning experiences. And then I'll just return before I pass it on to Jon with that idea that one feature of capstone programs as we understand them is that school specificity, that they emerge out of a local culture. There's no cake mix program. There's no one size fit all. There's no single thing that you just implement and now you've got it.
Jon, what else should we be thinking about when defining capstone education?
Yeah, that's a really good definition. I would just add that, like Nina mentioned, the bridge, capstones often occur at these transitions in schools. Our book is indeed largely about high school, but there are lots of programs in K through 12. For example, when you're leaving middle school and entering high school, there's a transition there that's appropriate for capstone. And it's interesting, at the introduction, we talked about how this might be new to you. Capstone might feel new. It doesn't necessarily go by that name all over the place, but there's lots of different programs that we feel like are capstone-ish or fit the model that we talk about because it's so adaptable, like Nina talked about.
Yeah, and as you referenced, they're happening at different grade levels, different transitions throughout the spectrum. And I think for many of those who are familiar with capstone projects or the concept, they might understand them as college level or even graduate level projects. I did a capstone project to get my master's degree, for example, but it's not only high schools even, but also middle, elementary school, 4th grade, 8th grade that are doing some of these capstone programs. Is there ways in which they look different at those different levels? What are some of those ways that might clue in maybe a 4th grade teacher, an 8th grade teacher who isn't initially thinking this is probably something that might be an option for them, but it actually is happening?
Well, Ross, one way they look different is that the capstone is designed to be engaging students at the limits of their developmental capacity. So whatever that is, so for an eighth grader, more concrete thinking, need for more support with the project management aspect, the scaffolding would be built in such a way that the student would be working at the limit, but not being pushed over into an area where the school really can't provide adequate support for them. High school students, really different place in terms of the types of thinking that can be done. So the abstract thinking, well-developed high school students by senior year with modern research methods, internet access, in the kinds of programs that Jon supervises, off-campus access, really can do work with support that can be equivalent to work done by an adult professional. Now, what they're doing is different from what an adult professional would be doing because they require that level of support. It's still a school program, but they're really extraordinary things get done by students at the high school level.
And as you mentioned earlier, each of these programs looks different regardless of the level it's happening. It's not cake mix, I think is the term you use, right? And I think no better way to illustrate that than the fact that at the individual schools at which each of you work and have worked, the programs look different, right? It's not exactly the same. I'd love to we'll start with you, Jon. Just talk through what the program looks like at Emma Willer to give, kind of an illustration of that. And then we'll also have Nina chime in.
Yeah, that's a great point because capstone is infinitely adaptable. You can literally stick it anywhere where there's an interest and a need for it, and it'll work. In my school, it's an optional program, and our 11th and 12th graders or juniors and seniors, they can take it if they choose to. It's a year-long program with a major presentation component at the end of it. Students come to us with their interests, and we help them shape them into ideas. So basically, if they have an idea that we deem interesting, they've got the time to do it, and they have some previous experience, then we allow them to join the program, and we help them build their projects. And we give them a lot of support in terms of resources and teachers to work at them, to set their goals, troubleshoot where they may, and then lead up to that final presentation. And an important point about the sharing at the end of it is that, as is true of all capstone programs, the thing they make conceptually or physically is just as important as the experience that they have. And those two things are featured at the end of the year. And they're usually a blast to observe.
Right, exactly. And Nina, my understanding from reading about the program that you had designed is that it shapes up similarly, but a little bit differently than that.
Well, I would say quite differently. I joined Bosque at a time when it already had a thriving program, a program that was already a centerpiece in the school's overall academic curriculum. And that program was very traditional in an academic sense. So it really was about text-based research and writing. So students were producing a research paper, 20 pages, which is, no small feat for a high school student. It was also and continues to be a required program. So every graduating senior was moving to that 20-page paper outcome. Over the years that I was involved in the program, there was an evolution to incorporate more of the types of experiences that at Jon's school were built in from the start. So more of those action elements, those embodied experiences, because we recognize that what is energizing about that text-based work for a lot of students is lived, new, vital experiences, usually off campus. So there was a shift in the time that I was there to incorporate more off-campus experiences, field work for students who wanted to stay in a research mindset, and that got incorporated into the program. That program is still evolving. So as of last word, Arthur Knox has the lead at Bosque there right now. And as the school itself is evolving to incorporate more experiential learning, I'm expecting that program will continue to grow as well.
One of the things that I think comes through clearly in the book is that you certainly feel that it would be great for every student to have the opportunity to participate in a capstone program. The way in which it's designed in schools doesn't require that every teacher, every educator is involved in it, but that the opportunities would be there for students, that there's really something they can, all gain. Why? Why should we be implementing these programs, and why do you believe that they are right for every student?
When we talk about how we want to train our kids for the future and what skills we want them to have when they leave school and enter the real world, because those environments are very different, strangely, they shouldn't be, but in a lot of the ways they are. Capstone programs really train them in that fashion. I think Capstone in a lot of ways is a lot more similar to what professionals do in the field. So in doing these things in which they troubleshoot and they explore their interests and hit walls and iterate and all of that amazing stuff that happens in Capstone, it really prepares them in a way that makes it really exciting.
Absolutely.
I can add to that. Everything Jon said is absolutely true, but I can also add that these programs are incredibly energizing for the students, for the teachers, and for the schools. And when we look at the types of reform and change that schools nationally are interested in achieving right now, experientially, we know from the work in the National Capstone Consortium that capstone programs are a fabulous way for schools to pilot types of teaching and learning that they are seeking system-wide, but that can be hard to get going in some of the more traditional departments. So that energizing effect that these programs have, I think, is just incredibly powerful and vitally needed right now.
Nina, as far as the teachers, what are the qualities of a teacher who's well suited to create or lead a capstone program? There's I think a good section on this in the foreword of your book that touches on the entrepreneurial spirit and some of the comfort with ambiguity and the fact that since these are such student-led projects that they go in a number of different directions. But there's a lot of other qualities here that teachers may reflect on and see in themselves and see themselves as a great candidate to start one of these programs. What are some of the qualities that you would want to highlight? And then we'll hear the ones that stand out to Jon as well.
Well, I love the metaphor that Jeff Hooper, who was the single person who got the National Capstone Consortium going with the original E.E. Ford grant many, many years ago. He used a metaphor in his foreword, which is about driver's ed, that a capstone teacher has to be comfortable with being in the passenger seat and really letting the student drive the car. So an ability to live with the messiness that happens with allowing students to get way out ahead, I think is absolutely the first thing. This doesn't mean that teachers are becoming irrelevant. So as I alluded to before, with the fact that the students are doing amazing work, but they're doing it with support, that teacher needs to be committed to providing that level of individualized support. Beyond that, in pretty much every project, the student is going to get out ahead of the teacher in terms of topic-specific expertise. So there's no single background that's required for capstone. Any type of background can actually work beautifully for a teacher in the capstone program. I'll pass it to Jon with that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the characteristics that work really well is creativity is a huge part of it. When students come to you with their ideas, coming up with ways that connect with them and giving them opportunities is a huge part of it. The way you interact with the students is radically different than most classrooms. Guide on the side is a phrase that comes to mind, where you are giving suggestions, you're throwing ideas at the student and getting them to a point where they're excited and motivated to work through it, especially when the work becomes challenging, is important. Collaboration is another key piece. You're often working with other adults to help support the students in the programs. And along with that, just being connected, because oftentimes what we find ourselves doing is saying, oh, I know a person who does that, or another person in the community or off campus who can help with them. Those are all things that are real helpful to working with the students.
Yeah, and I think another one of the qualities or characteristics mentioned in the book is curiosity, and that fits so neatly aligned to what Nina mentioned about that the student is going to get ahead of where the teacher is in that subject area specific expertise. So you want to be the kind of person who's curious to learn what the student is going to find out and say, I don't know anything about that, but yeah, I would like to know that. So let's explore that, right? Which is quite different than the typical class setup, but for good reason, because it's a particular type of project that really is based on the student's interest, passion, what they want to explore.
Yeah, that's an important point, because sometimes teachers feel a bit nervous about engaging in these kinds of programs because they might have expertise in one area but not another area. But if you're willing to be open to these interesting ideas and then help the student find resources often together, then it becomes much more manageable.
And I would add that that aspect is part of the way that these programs energize schools. John and I both wrote in the book about ways that our personal classroom teaching, so our teaching in more traditional modes, was transformed by experience in the capstone programs. In my case, I was exposed to the teaching principles of science teachers, and I was just, wow, like their understanding of argumentation, of what counts as data, of qualifying claims. I really need to be using that when I'm teaching English. And it was a great educational moment for me that came along in a point in my career when I was decades into teaching. So it was valued all the more for that.
And something else that fits along with this thread is the design of the learning in the capstone programs. You write it, that it's forward design, not backward plan. And I know many of our educators are certainly familiar with backward planning, whether it's understanding by design or other ways of doing that, and for good reason, right? Because in most classes, starting with the learning goals, working back to how we're going to get there is exactly the way you would want to go about it. But for good reason, capstone programs are designed a lot differently by nature. So, can you kind of explain a little bit more? And I think some of what you talked about already has sort of hinted at this, but that forward design, what that looks like, and why it's necessary to commit to that, right? John, can we start with you?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. In some ways, it's the favorite part of the book for me. Forward design is a really different way of thinking about working with students. In backward design, in my thinking, you sort of have a lot of things figured out and you have a strong sense of where the student is going to go, and your job is to kind of guide them through that channel. That's at least the way I think about it. And forward design is quite different, where you have some parameters that you establish at the beginning, some agreements, you have a sense of where you're going. You then provide enough resources to support the student through their exploration and their journey, and then you just go for it. And you make your way as you see fit. You do have a sense of the initial starting point, so you have a sense of where you were hoping to end up, but you're not sure exactly where it could end up. And I think in a lot of ways that is what makes these capstone programs amazing. One cool thing about the capstone programs is that when they're all done and the next generation of students is thinking about doing one, they can kind of be intimidated because these projects are so amazing. And I think a lot of it has to do with this forward design philosophy of just letting students explore as they wish, and then they end up doing amazing stuff.
And it's not necessarily always common in the K-12 span, at least, to settle into that dynamic of that there's a lot of things that as an educator I'm not expert in, that you may know more about me, right? But that we're kind of learning together, of course, as you go up, as these programs manifest in the higher education, it's a lot different, but that really is, such an important part of it. And realistically, Nina, I would definitely presume to say that if you do believe you know exactly where the projects are going to end up when they begin, you're not doing it correctly.
Ross, I think you're dead on with that. And I also think that this is related to the way these programs, to shift the topic away from teaching and learning to school reform a little bit, the way these programs sit in institutional structures and the opportunity they provide to change whole schools is very closely related to this forward designed example. Backward design, that's a beautiful concept. Like the work done by the people to develop the understanding, understanding by design is foundational for most of the people that I've met in Capstone. But that backward planning works inside a traditional classroom structure where I'm going to have to give tests, I'm going to have to grade students in a certain way. Those grades are going to be read by colleges in a certain way. I'm inside structures that very understandably are going to change very slowly. In the Capstone program, that program is, maybe it's housed in an academic department, but even if it is owned or housed by a specific academic department, its goals explicitly transcend that one discipline and are part of the school moving as a whole. And the forward planning concept captures that, and I think really gets at the heart of what enables these programs to move the entire community, students, teachers, and administrators forward.
I also want to make sure we've of course spent a good amount of time here talking about the teachers and how they're involved in this and their qualities, characteristics, design. I want to make sure that we also talk even a little bit more about the students. And I think for this next thought here, the two of you may have very different thoughts on it, which is great because that it proves the point that there's no one right way, there's no one way to design these programs. But I want to talk about the student learning experience, and ideally and generally, of course, because we're allowing for lots of adaptations and different ways of these programs. But from each of your individual perspectives, I mean, what would you propose that the student learning experience really can and should look like through these capstone programs? And along with that, what do you like to see the teacher-student interaction ideally look like? And of course, that's allowing for programs that are very much independent study, others that are more interactive, but and that's why there's every teacher is allowed to have their own perspective on it. But I'd love to hear from both of you. You know, when students are going through this, what are they experiencing? What should their learning be like? What is the interaction like through the process? Nina, how about we start with you?
Sure, and I think you're quite right that John and I will have very different answers on this one. My experience at Bosque, and I've also taught capstones at the college level, and I would say that it was similar there. I was very focused on skills acquisition. So I was very focused on seeing that each and every student was acquiring skills that would be familiar to teachers, honestly, going back a generation. So in terms of text-based research, reading skills, argumentative writing, the ability to write a draft, revise it, to foreground an argument, to maintain coherence, all of those very traditional skills, I wanted to see them acquired by students who were driven not by grades, not by extrinsic motivations, but by the joy of wanting to explain something that they were super excited about. So when I think about the learning experience, they're having this enormous, joyful, off campus, on campus experience that I may or may not be involved in every corner of that. The part of it that I'm focused on supporting is making sure that along the way they're acquiring the skills, even though the motivation is being driven in a very, very non-traditional way.
We definitely have the excitement in common. And I think in a lot of ways, Nina and our programs are on different parts of the continuum of capstone, which is a really important part of the whole concept, is that they can fit in lots of different places. But for the student perspective, we definitely have excitement in common, where this is one part that's really important for them to have when they enter in their project. At some point, it'll get tough. The idea that they had will hit some challenges that are very difficult to work through from their perspective. And so that motivation will become really important for them to motivate. I think it's really important for teachers to create some structure and a safe space for them to explore their project. It's very individualized, but there needs to be some protection in a sense if they were to fall, so to speak, so that they can take the risks that they need to do and explore the projects that they've come up with. And it's a totally different way of working with students. It's hard to appreciate until you have that experience with them. It's very much a partnership in which the teacher is very much still in the teacher role, but the interactions are very different. So there, to some degree, the respect that you have for the students and their ideas is different and valued, whereas it isn't in other traditional kinds of classrooms.
Are there any common mistakes, but just common kind of challenges or hurdles that you've seen present maybe in early stage kind of fledgling capstone programs that a lot of schools start here and then realize they have to adapt, adjust, to kind of get it right for the long-term sustainability? Anything that seems to come up kind of frequently?
I mean, I could speak to that by saying that we experientially in the National Capstone Consortium, what we observe is that programs succeed by piloting and tinkering. So piloting and then iterating and iterating and iterating. To take Jeff Hooper's program at the Thatcher School, that's a program that led the way in many ways, but Jeff will say that that program has never been the same 2 years in a row. So whatever is shifting in the rising generation of students is driving shifts in the program. I certainly would caution a school about doing a really large scale top-down implementation of Capstone with too many big features in place in the first year. We have a section in the book where we recommend, start optional before it's required. Start possibly ungraded before it's graded and transcripted. Start with a smaller number of teachers and students before having every single teacher and student involved in it. So that kind of letting it grow and having both the teachers, but also the school learn organically from what's working and not working. And then otherwise, I would say, yeah, you're going to make mistakes. That is going to happen. So being prepared that when those mistakes happen, they fall on adults rather on the students.
And I'll add that when you look at these programs across the country, some of them are just amazing and remarkable and just proud points for the schools. And for that reason, it can be kind of daunting to think about launching something like that at your school. So a mistake might be to not try something out because it looks so big and so amazing, and how can we possibly pull that off? There's a way to make it happen at your school. And like Nina says, you try out a version of it and get it going, like just start. And the last thing I'll add is that often teachers find themselves to be alone at their schools starting these programs. And by alone, I mean that in different ways, but they're usually a couple of people that are motivated to get this going. And there'll be that sense of, well, we're doing it together now. And that's kind of normal. And I wouldn't let that stand in the way of people getting things going, try something out. Often what happens, like Nina said before, is that it kind of grows in popularity for the students and the teachers and the administration. And that's how it like sneakily changes the whole school.
Yeah, and I would say in an education system and culture of evaluation and accountability and limited resources, that it's essential to go into this with the understanding and the mentality of it's going to be iterative. It's not going to be perfect the first year, or we're just going to keep improving as we go. That we're not judging ourselves that it's a failure or not worth doing because the first time we didn't do it exactly the way we think it'll be next time or the next time or the next time. Yeah. But it's best to know that ahead of time, right? Or else you're going to try to implement and then at the end of a year say, I'm not really sure about that. And it's hard to kind of pick it back up from there.
And Ross, that's really well said, Ross.
And I would just add that is what we're asking the students to do. So I think it is smart in a lot of ways to have the same philosophy guide the management of the program as the activities that are happening at the student level.
So one of the first steps that teachers could use to get started is, of course, to check out your book. What else would you recommend for if there's an administrator, teacher, or school who is thinking, okay, I want to learn more about this, maybe check this out, maybe get a pilot started in our school? Where should they begin?
We're obviously going to recommend the National Capstone Consortium. We have a website. We also have a mighty network. And I'll let John expand a little bit about how teachers who are interested might start with the website or the mighty network to connect with others and maybe, even get some support in terms of connecting with others at schools that have programs that are specifically like what that teacher is interested in doing. John, can you speak to the network a little bit more?
I can. So we have a great website that's up that can guide people towards us and learn more about the program. And then we have a private network that is free to join called the Mighty Network, in which you can connect with other educators across the country, public, independent, all different grade levels, to share resources. And that's one of the great aspects of Capstone teachers is their willingness to share resources and ideas. So a wonderful way to get started is just to connect with someone online or in person. There might be a program nearby that you could visit. I strongly encourage people to visit schools and see what teachers and the students are up to. But once you make those connections, usually information flows. We have had schools come to our summer summit and literally create a handbook from scratch, go from 0 to 100 just in the week or so that they're with us, primarily because of the generosity of teachers and their ideas just is always open and sharing.
So, listeners, we will make sure to put those resources in the show notes. We'll, of course, have a link to the book, Capstone Inquiry in Action at School. We'll also link to the consortium and other helpful resources so that you can learn more about this, as well as check out the reflection questions so you can just kind of think about your practice, your school, and how some of these ideas might fit into your work. So make sure to check all that out. And thank you, John and Nina, for joining Author Chats.